On this Wednesday night, compensation for Indigenous children. The federal court rejects an appeal and orders Ottawa to pay up.
Children would be denied basic things.
The ruling and its significance on the eve of Canada's first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. The deepening COVID crisis on the prairies and the effect on everyone waiting for care.
The amount of suffering is catastrophic.
Home sweet home. The family who protected an American whistleblower starts their new life in Canada. Plus, safe and sound on higher ground.
It was good. It was fun. Couldn't tell if it was night or day.
Relief for all 39 miners rescued in Ontario.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin tonight with a pivotal decision affecting thousands of Indigenous children and their families who have been discriminated against by the federal government, a legacy of the residential school system. The federal court has upheld a landmark Canadian Human Rights Tribunal order, which ordered Ottawa to pay $40,000, the maximum allowed under the Canadian Human Rights Act, to each child affected by the on-reserve child welfare system since 2006. It also upheld a separate tribunal order that said the federal government must consider some non-status First Nations kids eligible for the Jordan's Principle program. In his decision, Justice Paul Favell, a member of the Poundmaker Cree Nation in Saskatchewan, wrote, "No one can seriously doubt that First Nations people are amongst the most disadvantaged and marginalized members of Canadian society." And he said the parties must decide whether they will continue to sit beside the trail or move forward in this spirit of reconciliation. The federal government had argued both orders should be quashed, and today it lost. David Akin has our top story tonight. David?
Donna, as many as 60,000 First Nations kids, and possibly many more than that, have been removed from their homes over the last 15 years and placed into foster care. And advocates of those children say the harm they suffered was similar in many ways to the harm suffered by residential school survivors, and often a direct result of their parents' suffering in those schools.
Families couldn't recover from residential schools, so their children were separated from them and put in foster care.
Cindy Blackstock has been leading the legal fight on this issue for nearly 2 decades, first at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal and eventually to the federal court. She and other First Nations advocacy groups also complain that First Nations kids do not get the same public health care that non-Indigenous kids do.
Children would be denied basic things. The federal government, for example, put a cap on feeding tubes for children who were critically ill. You as a parent would have to decide, do you rewash the feeding tube and risk infection to your child, or do you don't feed them at all?
For the harm and discrimination they endured, the Human Rights Tribunal ordered each child who was sent into the child welfare system to receive $40,000 in compensation, an order that could cost the federal treasury $2 billion or more. But Ottawa appealed that order. Government ministers said it was not to avoid paying out compensation, but rather to establish what the government believed were some important legal precedents on the process to resolve this and future claims of harm.
The government has acknowledged the need to compensate children for the harms they have suffered and denial of services. One of them, these complex matters are before the court, and our job is to resolve them in a fair and just way.
But now the Federal Court of Canada has ruled against the government, and advocates say it's time to pay.
The federal government needs to stop its racial discrimination and provision of public services right now. It needs to put down its sword. It needs to obey the orders. It needs not to appeal this decision, and it needs to fully honor the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action.
So far, no definitive reaction from the federal government other than to say it is reviewing the ruling, but it could very well take it to the Supreme Court. Donna?
Okay, David Akin in Ottawa, thanks. The very first calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report are about child welfare, because the way Indigenous kids are still treated today is a legacy of the residential school system. The TRC's first 5 calls to action call for reducing the number of Aboriginal children in care by providing adequate resources to enable Aboriginal communities and child welfare organizations to keep Aboriginal families together where it is safe to do so. Also to affirm the rights of Aboriginal governments to establish and maintain their own child welfare agencies, and to fully implement Jordan's Principle. In 2015, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau promised to fully implement all 94 calls to action in the TRC report. Well, today is the eve of the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. A little later, we'll look at the significance of the day, why it was created, and how it will be observed across the country. The president of the Canadian Medical Association is urgently calling for tough new measures in Alberta and Saskatchewan, saying the early relaxation of public health measures has left two crumbling healthcare systems in their wake. To date, 34 more deaths were reported in Alberta. It's the second deadliest day of the pandemic. The CMA wants firebreakers or circuit breakers to aggressively control COVID-19 cases, and it's pleading for provincial and federal governments to work together. The Medical Association says what's happening is as heartbreaking as it was preventable. Alberta's premier is no longer ruling out bringing in tighter restrictions, but he hasn't done it yet. And it's not only people with COVID who are affected, it is anyone who needs hospital care. Heather Yourex-West reports.
With disaster nipping at its heels, Alberta's health system keeps adding beds. Provincially, the ICU capacity has now more than doubled. But every day, more patients arrive with COVID-19.
I'm changing my own behavior. I'm encouraging family members to change their own behavior, because when you call on the healthcare system, there may not be the capacity for it to actually be there for you.
With Saskatchewan facing a similar surge, the Canadian Medical Association is calling on both provincial governments to do more. The crisis can no longer be solved by vaccine alone. What's needed, they say, is a lockdown.
People are dying, at ridiculous rates. The amount of suffering is catastrophic, and healthcare workers are completely burnt out.
After dismissing calls for a firebreak lockdown over the weekend, Alberta's premier admitted Tuesday that more restrictions may be needed, just not yet.
We want to take a look at the data as it emerges over the next several days to ascertain what impact the recent round of measures has had. It's too early for us to make that assessment.
If current restrictions do not work, Kenny says provincial modelling suggests Alberta could run out of ICU capacity late next month. Saskatchewan hospitals are facing increasing pressures as well. Both provinces have had to cancel most scheduled surgeries, and Saskatchewan has paused its organ donation program.
This halt of this program affects Canadians nationwide. This may very well result in more patients dying while waiting on the transplant list.
A terrifying thought for this Calgary mother of three.
It just means more waiting and more, like, my symptoms get worse, my eyes get yellower, my bruising gets worse, my ascites gets worse, and the waiting gets longer.
As the COVID surge on the prairies becomes a total healthcare crisis, there is still no foreseeable end. Heather Yourex-West, Global News, Calgary.
A rise in cases of a rare heart condition in young adults who got the Moderna vaccine has prompted Ontario to recommend the Pfizer vaccine for people aged 18 to 24. The province says the risk of myocarditis and pericarditis among males aged 18 to 24 is about 1 in 5,000 after a second dose of Moderna and about 1 in 28,000 after the Pfizer vaccine. The province says most cases of the heart condition are mild, no deaths have been linked to the condition, and fewer than 10 people have been admitted to Ontario ICUs suffering from it. And in Newfoundland and Labrador, travel restrictions are being reintroduced for children under 12 entering the province. The new rules require them to stay home from school and sporting events and away from vulnerable populations for at least a week after they arrive. After day 7, children between 5 and 11 years can get tested and are permitted to attend school if they get a negative result. Well, online giants like Google and Facebook are responsible for allowing anti-science and anti-vaccine misinformation to spread. And now YouTube, owned by Google, says it's cracking down. YouTube is taking down several video channels associated with high-profile anti-vaccine activists, including Joseph Mercola and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And it will ban any videos that claim commonly used vaccines approved by health authorities are ineffective or dangerous. Until now, YouTube only restricted videos promoting COVID-19 misinformation. And there are exceptions. YouTube will still allow videos about vaccine policies and trials and personal testimonials relating to vaccines. The leader of the Bloc Québécois is calling for Parliament to get to work as soon as possible, and when it does, he thinks all MPs should be there in person. Yves-François Blanchet says there is no longer any reason to have hybrid sittings of the House of Commons, with some MPs attending virtually. He says anyone who works on Parliament Hill should be vaccinated or should stay home.
We should not refrain from doing so, because a few person don't believe that the vaccine works. This belongs to another century.
When asked about MPs who might be uncomfortable sitting in a full room, Blanchet said something could be worked out with reduced but proportional representation from each party. There's a happy ending to what could have been a terrible incident. After a 2-day rescue operation, those 39 miners who were working deep inside a mine near Sudbury, Ontario, are now on the surface and they're all safe. The elevator in the mine became blocked and it was a grueling climb up, a series of ladders to get to the surface. As Mike Drolet reports, the miners are in good spirits and thankful to be back with loved ones.
As the sun rose on the Totten mine, the relief was palpable as news spread that the last of the 39 miners stuck underground emerged at 4:45 a.m.
A lot of smiles, a few laughs, fist pumping, and congratulations going on.
They've earned it with all the anxious hours spent waiting and wondering after a routine equipment transfer went awry Sunday afternoon. A giant scoop bucket began tumbling down the mine's main shaft after it broke free from the elevator it was attached to. Because of its size, it only fell 30 meters, but it still caused significant damage lodged in the shaft. There's no telling how much worse it would have been if it had fallen the shaft's full 1,200 meters. Their main exit blocked, the miners waited for Plan B.
It was good. It was fun. Couldn't tell if it was night or day.
If they didn't seem worried, it's because they knew they were never trapped. A secondary escape route was always available. It just wasn't very appealing. A narrow culvert lined with ladders running the full length of the mine. It's a steep, wet, and dark journey to climb the equivalent of 2.5 CN towers.
For the average worker, climbing ladders is not part of their daily routine, so this is well outside of their normal routine, and that is the reason why we had the medical team here.
From the beginning, mine officials say they knew they had a robust rescue plan in place. They also know the inherent dangers associated with working more than 1 kilometer underground. It's the unknown, they say, that keeps them up at night.
We are not at the point where we need to be in terms of being able to guarantee that we can avoid every incident.
As for when the mine will reopen, that's anyone's guess. Everything below ground right now is shut down until further notice. And really, that was the furthest thing from their mind today, because as they say, the most important thing to come out of mines is miners. Mike Drolet, Global News, near Sudbury, Ontario.
Starting over, coming up, the family who sheltered whistleblower Edward Snowden is given asylum in Canada. A Sri Lankan family who helped shelter whistleblower Edward Snowden 8 years ago in Hong Kong has been granted asylum in Canada and arrived to build a new life here. Snowden, a former U.S. National Security Agency contractor, was on the run after leaking secret surveillance files. Mike Armstrong explains how this family helped him and what they've endured since.
A tremendous amount of work went into this.
It has been years of effort. Marc-André Séguin is part of a Canadian group called For the Refugees. It was founded for this moment, the arrival of this family on Canadian soil. They landed in Toronto Tuesday and then made it to their new home in Montreal late Tuesday night. The group had it ready for them.
They were speechless, having a place that they could call home, that already had their picture, the family pictures on the wall and everything. It was a very emotional moment for all of us.
Sapun Kelapata and Nadika Nonis are now permanent residents in Canada, along with their 2 children. The family was part of a small network of refugees in Hong Kong that in 2013 hid an international fugitive. Edward Snowden has been called a hero and a whistleblower by some, a traitor by others. The former CIA employee and NSA contractor leaked highly classified information and exposed the scope and scale of U.S. intelligence surveillance. On the run, Snowden spent 2 weeks in Hong Kong hiding in the homes of refugees. He then escaped to Russia and requested asylum.
Once they say...
Snowden was eventually granted permanent residency in Russia, but he's still wanted in the U.S. for violating the Espionage Act. Upon hearing news, one of the families that helped him is now in Canada. Snowden took to Twitter, calling it, quote, the best news I've heard in a long, long time.
Everyone.
Now, some have questioned whether granting asylum to a family that helped a U.S. fugitive could ruffle feathers in Washington. Well, if that was a problem, those feathers were already ruffled. Another family arrived in Canada in 2019.
It was not only about what we thought Snowden did and the fact that we thought that he did the right thing as a whistleblower. It was also doing something for these families who were nothing but good Samaritans.
Now, there is one more so-called Snowden guardian angel still in Hong Kong. The group says it's working on getting him to Canada as well. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
2 are home, over 100 still detained. Ahead, what's being done for other Canadians imprisoned in China. Red-hot lava from Spain's La Palma volcano has now reached the Atlantic Ocean 9 days after the volcano came alive. Lava met water overnight, sending ashy plumes into the sky, and authorities are warning residents to seal their doors and windows in case toxic gases are released. Lava has destroyed hundreds of homes and forced thousands of people to flee. Well, after spending more than 1,000 days in detention in China, it was a relief when Canadians Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig were released last week. Dozens of other Canadians, though, are still behind bars in China, and their loved ones don't want them forgotten. As Abigail Beeman explains, their circumstances are different, and whether they have a path home is deeply uncertain.
This new baby is one of 6 grandchildren Wang Bingjiang has never met. The pro-democracy activist has been a prisoner in China for close to 20 years.
It's devastating to all of us that, we don't know if he'll ever meet any of them.
Daughter Tiana Wang knows he's still alive, but that's about it. She says her family was relieved to see Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor back on Canadian soil. She hopes others won't be forgotten.
I don't know if, people like my father will ever receive that level of support and attention. So that, that's something that is, I guess, concerning to me, that that's perhaps what it took to eventually get the release. But we have to be hopeful.
Wang's father is not a Canadian citizen, but deeply connected. He and others like him are likely not counted in official Global Affairs Canada counts. About 115 Canadians still imprisoned in China, including 4 sentenced to death. Most recently, Robert Schellenberg, whose family still declines interviews but released new photos and a statement, still hoping there would be a change in Bob's status.
I am very angry.
Uyghur activist and Canadian Hussein Jalil has been imprisoned since 2006 with no consular access. His wife can't even say for sure he's alive.
Through this government, they proved they can deal with China. The next step is to bring my husband back home to Canada.
She ramped up her calls to government in the wake of the Spavor-Kovrig homecoming and says no one called her back.
There is always more to do.
The Prime Minister was asked about Jalil's case this week. He didn't name him in his answer.
We will continue to advocate for people who are wrongly imprisoned around the world.
There needs to be more attention paid to these other prisoners who have received no attention whatsoever.
I think the Chinese were surprised at the degree to which we were able to mount broader international pressure to raise the Michael issue. That's not going to happen with these other cases, whatever their merits may or may not be.
A tough juxtaposition for dozens of Canadian families holding out hope. Abigail Beeman, Global News, Ottawa.
Next, the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, what it means and how it will be marked. We're on the eve of the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and the hope is it will mean more than just a day off or a day to wear an orange shirt. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission called for a day to ensure that public commemoration of the history and legacy of residential schools remains a vital component of the reconciliation process, and to honor the survivors. This is recent history. Survivors are still here. Eric Sorensen looks at how the day will be marked.
It is a day of commemoration a long time in coming, considering the enduring legacy of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples. In Halifax, a walk in solidarity for reconciliation took place. St. Mary's University staff and students organizing time to reflect.
And to acknowledge that in tandem we're walking with people who have been victimized by systematic racism in Canada.
The National Day for Truth and Reconciliation will honor survivors and the children who died in residential schools. The discovery of hundreds of unmarked graves at different sites has horrified Canadians. Many are only beginning to fully appreciate the pain and the resilience of Indigenous people.
I would love Canadians to participate, wear an orange shirt, reach out to their local Indigenous communities, find out what events are happening, attend them.
It's a very real thing, and all of those children have relatives that are alive today that are grieving.
School districts, including Delta BC, are now offering more Indigenous instruction. The province of Ontario announced today Indigenous studies will be added to the curriculum for younger students, grades 1 to 3.
Strengthening the curriculum with respect to Indigenous learning in residential schools, I think we can pursue our commitment to reconciliation in a much more meaningful way.
Sometimes called Orange Shirt Day is now a federal holiday, so all federal workers will be off. Federally regulated industries, including banks and post offices, will be closed, but only in certain provinces, BC, Manitoba, PEI, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland and Labrador, will most provincial government offices and schools be closed. In some provinces not designating a holiday, some cities are giving municipal workers the day off. And most businesses, but not all, will be open. Some are disappointed there isn't more uniform commemoration across the country.
That's the inconsistency that First Nations, Métis and Inuit people have looked at for over 100 years. There's been a lot of rhetoric and not a lot of action and consistency.
Reconciliation with Indigenous people will be a long and difficult road. A day to learn and reflect can, for many Canadians, be a first step on that road. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
That is Global National for this Wednesday. I'm Donna Friesen. A ceremony is underway tonight in Ottawa ahead of Truth and Reconciliation Day. It's happening on Parliament Hill to honor the lost Indigenous children, residential school survivors, and all the lives in communities affected by the Indian residential school system. Thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.